So welcome to season 2 of our Inspire the Mind series of interviews for KCL. I'm Rachel Kelly. I'm a writer and mental health advocate, and I work alongside charities. I'm an ambassador for SANE and Rethink Mental Illness. And I'm delighted today to welcome Keith Leslie. Keith is the chair of Samaritans. I'm going to check with Keith whether that's right. I don't think we say the Samaritans anymore. And Keith and I, we actually first met, albeit virtually, like many of us, in the summer. And I was really impressed by Keith and all his work and a kind of lifetime's dedication to psychological well-being and mental health. So without more ado, I'd like to say welcome to Keith, and thank you very much, Keith, for joining us on Inspire the Mind.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
Great. So I just wanted to start, Keith, if you could just tell us a little bit about where you were born, where you were brought up, your background, just so we can have a little bit of scene setting, just to know a little bit more about you as a person.
Indeed. So I was born and grew up in Kirkcaldy in Fife, just north of Edinburgh. My father, a shopkeeper, and my mother, a teacher. In fact, teachers dominated the family in the generations below my grandparents. Virtually everyone apart from me went into teaching. And I went to the local school, Kirkcaldy West Primary, then on to Kirkcaldy High School, where there was one Gordon Brown, who was still a student there when I was,
Wow.
and his younger brother, Andrew, both of whom I came across again later in life. But the story in relation to mental health probably also starts about then, because my mother was seriously mentally ill her entire life. And although that first became apparent to me aged 7 or 8, when I thought back to incidents, I could then see that I had observed psychotic incidents then. But it was only after our father, I have a sister 3 years younger, after our father died when I was 12, that essentially things became much worse with my mother. So you can imagine losing a husband and the love of her life, reached someone who's mentally seriously unwell. So not just anxiety or depression, but one of the more serious medical illnesses, tipped her into regular psychotic phases. And I think this is where the first really important distinction comes between how life was then and how it is now, or indeed how it should be now. It isn't always. And that is that back in those bad old days, we're talking the mid-70s, nobody talked about mental ill health. It was something to be ashamed of. It was something you didn't talk about. And my grandparents, great people though they were part of that pattern. So when my mother was sectioned and vanished into hospital, and I was going to visit her in a psychiatric hospital, no one talked to me about that. I had no idea what was wrong with her, no idea what the treatments were, no idea when she was going to come home, no idea as to what to expect.
And how did that feel? Obviously, a terrible suffering from your mother, but how did it feel for you as a child? You know, in this very uncertain, unknowing state of what was going on.
Indeed, I think what it resulted in was a clear message that there was no one I could talk to, and therefore no one I could rely on to help me out in this. So it, I think, did encourage an attitude for me and for my sister of being very self-contained. So we weren't necessarily going to share things with others. Interestingly, it's only when the Tablet and other magazines have covered my story on becoming chair of Samaritans that I've been contacted by old school friends who said, we knew nothing about this.
Wow.
And if we'd known, maybe we would have done things differently. But in those days, who knew what to do?
So quite a lonely childhood, but bonded with your sister, perhaps, that both of you experienced this.
Yes, although it's all very complex when you're an adolescent carer. Because although we didn't call ourselves that in essence was what we had fallen into. Right. But the natural response to that is not necessarily a bonding one always. It is to some extent. But I think apart from being very self-contained and self-reliant as a result, I think my immediate reaction was really to get away from it. So I went
Right.
to Edinburgh University, graduated 5 years later, and essentially then said goodbye to Scotland. And part of that, I'm sure, was also just getting away from the family situation.
How interesting. And what happened? Your mother, she recovered, or she stayed very unwell? Did she, how long was she still part of your life?
She only died 18 months ago.
Oh,
So,
okay.
and I would only talk about her in this public way
Okay.
after that.
Okay.
So she lived a good long age, and
Right.
probably a year or two longer than her mother did.
Yeah.
And she played a role in the life of her grandchildren. She
Okay.
never entirely overcame her illness. It continued to be episodic, and at the end of her life spent a very long period in care homes because she
Right.
was unable to completely look after herself. So
Okay.
unlike most people who spend only 2 or 3 years in a care home at the very end of life, she spent 20 years in care home.
Gosh. And that point about not opening up about it at the time, and as you say, that you learned to be very quiet and not talk about it. Why do you think it's helpful to talk about it?
Well, I think firstly, there's just a general principle that talking, sharing, and listening is good for all of us. And of course, you'd expect to hear the chair of Samaritans say that, because that's the whole business that we are in, which is listening and talking. And we believe that fundamentally one human being, albeit not medically trained, in fact, because they're not medically trained, listening to another human being's distress is a very powerful thing. So I think that's the first reason. I think the second one is that along with this isolation of and othering of mental illness, went a view that not only was it shameful, but it was something strictly medical. So if you weren't a doctor, there was nothing you could do to help. And in those days, of course, I think many modern psychiatrists would say the problem back in the 70s is many of the treatments were as bad as the illness. And things have advanced enormously in the last 50 years. Lithium was only being prescribed for the first time in the 60s and 70s, for example. And that was a step change in treating psychiatric issues. But I think at that stage and until quite recently, we hadn't truly understood that mental illness is not predominantly a genetic or chemical issue. It's really only in the last 20 to 25 years that we've learned that actually your environment and your experience has much more to do with your mental well-being and good health
So
than
connecting and
your
talking
chemistry.
so connecting and talking to other people is crucial. So if you take that away, your mental health is going to be worsened.
Yes, it is. And especially the ability to enjoy from day to day good mental health. Because these days we understand that it's not just, are you ill or are you not? Are you diagnosed or are you not? It's like physical well-being, fitness, and good health. You have days when you're feeling physically better than others.
Yeah.
And likewise, you have days when you're feeling mentally stronger than others. And one of the things that drives better days than others is ability to talk and work and live in an environment that is supportive.
Okay, I really agree, and that's really moving to hear. And as you say, your kind of very personal, experience of this. So you go to Edinburgh University and you read
law.
You read law, okay, fantastic, and then you pursue a business career. Is that right? You
Indeed.
move...
So I took a year off halfway through the 4-year law degree after I was elected president of the Students' Association. So back in 1977, aged 19 or so, I had 250 employees and a budget of £1 million a year. And back in 1977, £1 million was real money, whereas these days it's much less. So essentially in that year of running that organization, I basically realized that I wanted to be engaged in management and organizations, that the law, fascinating though it was, and I remain fascinated by it, the law was not going to be the profession for me. And I think also not coming from a legal family, certainly back then, the people who are going to get into the best firms and probably advance faster in their careers were ones who came from a legal stock, and I didn't.
Interesting. And so talk us through a little bit of your business career. Was mental health a part of that, or at this early stage, or not so much?
Not particularly, not particularly. I mean, the themes did come together eventually, but I then went off to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, the world's first business school, and did a 2-year Master of Business Admin there, and then joined Shell. And I joined Shell in the days when that was viewed as quite a virtuous company to join, not as it seems to be viewed, along with many other fossil fuel companies, as a son of Satan. So the part of the fascination was, of course, a big global multinational, then I think reckoned to be the second biggest company in the world. And very exciting opportunities, the prospect of working abroad, which I had tasted from working in America. And also right at the period when we talked about living through an energy crisis. These days we talk rightly about the climate crisis, and the fossil fuel companies have a huge part to play in resolving that. But back in the 70s, it was about how on earth do we keep the lights on and the cars running, as much as it was the impact on the climate. So it was also something that just was an important business to work in. So I spent 13 years with Shell, working in the UK, then New Zealand, then Sweden, then Cyprus, running business in Sweden and running all of the operations in Cyprus, and then coming back to the UK. So that was essentially the first of the 3 phases of my employment history, was coming to grips with the basics and learning how to be a general manager in Shell.
Because you then moved more into consultancy with McKinsey's and Deloitte's and other firms like that.
Indeed. I basically realized that at the age of 35, I was either going to commit the rest of my career to Shell or think of moving on. And for a variety of reasons, I thought, let's go and join a consulting firm for a couple of years, see a number of other industries, and then come back into being chief exec again somewhere else. But in fact, what I discovered was being a consultant was something I loved, and working in those firms and doing that kind of work, where I was in a whole series of clients over the years, one of the few people privileged enough to talk at board level, as one would expect the senior management who'd hired me, but also intervening and understanding and learning from what was happening at the front line.
Sure.
And that all that was in between, which generally the senior management weren't doing themselves.
No, I absolutely get that. So I suppose I'm interested that, this is a high-powered, demanding, potentially stressful, commercial career. How was your own mental health through this period? You knew you had that background of your mother being unwell, but you managed to cope with the stress. You weren't unwell yourself.
I think what I knew about myself was that there were various crises along the way, as you would expect in as you described, pretty fast-moving commercial career. So there were periodic crises where it would be down to me to pull through the crisis. And I think some of what I'd learned about being very self-contained and self-reliant was very positive then.
Right.
Some of it, I think, was quite negative because I was not reaching out for support and help to the extent that I should have done. But that, of course, probably only became more apparent in retrospect than at the time. But over the years, particularly as a consultant, so later in my career, I think I was much more effective than I was early on, when I thought in the rather fake, heroic single leader model, which business thinking was really worshipping that idol of the leader who tackled crises single-handedly, which we've all moved on from. I think when it comes to mental health, what I gravitated towards was working more in the field of leadership and organization. So how do we structure and manage and lead people so that they can be more successful? That it's not just about good strategy or good investment, it's about the people in the organization. And that's a topic that academic thinkers and consultants at the time were just beginning to scratch the surface of.
And do you think, because I know you started to be involved in some of the mental health organizations, the charity, the Mental Health Foundation, as you say, you becoming interested in leadership and how that works. Do you think that what sort of drew you to it? Was it a feeling that people needed help? They weren't really considering their psychological well-being, or was it your family background that took you sort of in that direction, as it were, of thinking about people's well-being?
I think there were two or three different things. I think the first one was, in a sense, quite a business-like approach, particularly in the days when I was at McKinsey, where most of my partners in the firm would say, solving businesses' problems or organizations' problems, because we were starting to serve the Blair government at that time, a new departure. Solving their problems is an issue of having the right strategy. If you just go in the right direction, then your problems will be resolved. And the conundrum that I was observing with my clients was that the right strategy wasn't enough on its own. If they didn't have the right human competency, then they were not going to get there. And I could see many players out there, including a number of my clients, who are following pretty haphazard strategies, but because they had very effective organizations and leadership, they were still being more successful than others who might have had the more intellectually satisfying strategy. And my observation at the time, much has changed since then, was that McKinsey was satisfying itself with saying, well, we told them the right strategy. If they didn't follow it or didn't implement it very well, then it's not our problem. Now, I think all of these firms, including McKinsey, have moved on to say, actually, we now need to be confident that we're bequeathing a strategy that is doable by this organization. And we need to help them develop their capabilities to actually be successful. It's not enough to just write a report and write a strategy. So that was one theme. I think the other was, by coincidence, I started being contacted by old university friends and became more involved in the charity sector, big voluntary organizations that had essentially the same organizational challenges as we were serving commercially. And so I was starting to test out, well, was this different or was it the same? Could you take the same thinking about capability into charities and churches? And then the third thing that happened was, after I first got involved in the charity sector, I started to then become interested in becoming a trustee of charities. So I took on my first trusteeships in 2006. And they weren't in mental health, but they were the opportunities that presented themselves. And then I found the opportunity to essentially then reconnect with what had been part of my agenda from early life, which was, what can we do in the world of mental health? And I started as a complete amateur.
So for what I'm hearing, that point about organizations, and I know it's something that we've talked about, that if we're not necessarily, the NHS may well not be able to cope with the numbers of people who report themselves anxious or depressed. And so that we need organizations which feel psychologically safe, which feel happy and well-adjusted places for people to work. And it sounds like when you were advising companies, you had this sort of strategic input, but then you said it's also about the people and the people being able to deliver those strategies. So my question is, how can you make organizations more friendly to people's well-being and mental health? Maybe it's a huge topic, and I know you've written a brilliant book about leadership as well, but are there a kind of like a couple of conversations that you feel that managers should be having? What would you recommend?
I think, like many complex and difficult topics, it comes down to a couple of quite simple themes. The first theme, I think, is be a good leader. Don't try and pretend to be a therapist. And the second theme is back to this point about talking and listening and showing the way. So on the first theme, there's huge suspicion amongst many senior leaders in organizations, whether those organizations are profit-making, government, or the NHS or charities, with all the discussion that's going on about mental health. So people are paying a lot of lip service, but very frequently they're saying, can you just make sure we don't have a problem? Or what's the right way to deal with our problem people who are having difficulty? And of course, that's been magnified through the pandemic. Everyone's talking about mental health, although I'm quite skeptical about how genuine much of this commentary is. So the first thing I say to people is, let's be very clear about this. This is not asking you to move away from being an effective leader or an effective strategist or an effective investor. What this is bringing in front of you the facts about how you can be more effective and make more money or achieve your other charitable or governmental outcomes by paying attention to the mental health of your organization. So that's the first theme. It's about being a good leader. It's not about sacrificing what your goals are or your profits would be in favor of something fuzzy.
So it's not an either or.
No, it's not an either or.
Okay.
And what I say to people is, for example, most of the big firms in the city are now running quite serious mental health at work programs. Now, who was the first maybe to do that? And of course, we might think it might be who's some of the more altruistic firms or foundations that we know. In fact, it's not. The firm that first became big in this area is the one that is most notorious as a ruthless profit-making organization, and that's Goldman Sachs.
Goldman Sachs, I was about to say.
And the reason that they got into it, rapidly followed by many others, and it's a litany of big names in the city, is that they employ very highly paid people. And if those people can be more productive or more present at work,
I'm not burned out.
And not burned out,
Yeah.
then it's worth a lot of money. And they twig that, because they're smart people, they twig that early. And I think it's great if there's money to be made out of better mental health, because then more people will invest in it. So I have no problem with that. The second one is, I think, not so much targeted at senior people, but you need to offer that cover to middle and frontline people that senior people support them and see that it's an economic thing to do. But it's to the second theme about talking and listening.
Yeah.
So this is not about becoming a therapist or getting qualified or bringing in counselors. These are about the conversations that frontline managers and supervisors should always have been having with their people about getting the best from them from day to day by understanding where they're at, by noticing if people are becoming burned out in an extreme case, or in the periodic case when women are coming back from maternity leave, saying, so you're coming back next week, what can we do to make sure that the first few days go well? Shall we check in at the end of the day just to hear how it's been? No, I'm seeing this happening. How are you feeling about it? To the day-to-day stuff with anyone that you're dealing with, which says, no, is anything happening today? You seem a bit quieter than normal. Or, and this is probably the most powerful thing you can do, is saying, well, actually, I'm having a difficult day today. Let me tell you about what's going on at home for me that I'm anxious about. Or let me tell you about what's happening at work that I'm anxious about. And maybe you can help me out today.
So by opening up yourself, that allows others to open up.
Precisely.
Right.
And certainly, I remember back in the 90s in McKinsey, people saying that when the partners, so I and others, quite rarely then, I think, so people noticed it, did open up and say, just be aware that this and this is happening for me this week. So I might be a bit distracted, or maybe you guys can do this for me, or not bring me this to deal with.
Yeah.
That people said, no, that was very powerful. And we move away from the idea of partners being superhuman beings who weren't subject to the human frailties that we all have. They're human after all, and we should engage with them as human beings.
So you made the point that maybe this isn't too complicated, that you made 2 points, first about leaders understanding the importance of the mental well-being of their staff, and then this comment about understanding and chatting and listening. I mean, it sounds, not much more than kind of common courtesies, almost a sort of, just sort of more like friendship, really. I mean, so sometimes it feels that there's a lot of kind of practical initiatives, whether that's sort of check-in meetings or well-being walks or group yoga. Your approach is, in a way, what you might hope for anyway, as you yourself said.
Yes, and I think there's a couple of points to make. One is to not wish away the fact that there's a lot of complexity potentially around mental health when people are unwell. And that is not going away, and that is complex to deal with and expensive and so forth. And secondly, I would say that all the material that you suggest around special events, that's there to make things happen, because unfortunately, day to day, for many people, there isn't that conscious attitude to well-being at work. And I would say it's not about friendliness. I think it's about what falls away when people are stressed at work. And stress is one of the, I think, killer activities. And I know even now people talk sometimes about good stress versus bad stress. And whenever I get that question, I'm very explicit in saying, if you do change one thing, please don't ever talk about good stress again. It's fine to talk about work being challenging or difficult. And there's a reason that pay is often called compensation. It's difficult and you're doing things up to do it. But stress is never good. Stress, when you ask people to talk about stress in their work life, they always talk about feeling unwell to some extent or another, or feeling less than optimal, about rushing through work, about bad things happening potentially. There's never a good aspect to stress. There's a good aspect to appropriate challenge, but that should come without stress. And stress is the reason that managers run around too busy to have the conversation that says, hey, I noticed that no, you don't seem quite as bright and cheerful as normal. Anything going on? Stress is the reason they can't find 5 minutes for that conversation. And it's when you see that going on that you then think, well, maybe we have to play some games here of regular check-ins or whatever that will encourage people to break free of a pattern they've got too used to at work.
Okay, so you kind of have the structures because, as you say, life rushes past, and sometimes if it's not in the diary, it's just not going to happen. But on that point of stress, do you think people are responsible for managing their own stress? I mean, is it more that each of us, has to learn to our own strategies, our own individual way, coping with the stress bucket that people talk about, completing the stress cycle, as it were. You come home from your commute and you do your 10 jumping jacks before you open the door. I mean, whose responsibility is it really to manage stress?
Well, I think, ultimately it's everyone's responsibility, because part of the problem of stress, of course, is that it's not contained in the workplace. So the source of stress that you may be bringing in and causing to affect your work may be something that's going on at home, something good or something bad or something unavoidable. And of course, stress is something that some people will take from work back into home life. And abuse of alcohol and so forth is often linked to that as well. So this is where we get into mental health isn't as simple as just two principles. It can be very complex. And again, when it comes to the workplace, I say to people, don't ever talk about good stress. I also say to leaders, watch out for people who are yielding short-term positive results for the organization by putting their people under stress. Because that ultimately is something that you have got to stop. It's very difficult, particularly if they're giving you good results in the short term. But over the medium term, they will be burning out your people. You will be losing high potential people. You have to think about how do I measure that in my organization so I can stop that? And again, that's quite complex and challenging. So the basic principles may be straightforward, but we very quickly get into difficult arguments.
And so you and I have talked before a bit more about sort of where we are right now in terms of, are we facing a mental health crisis? How bad is it? What are we going to be doing about it? I know we've talked in the past about having a sort of more psychologically healthy workplace is maybe one answer, especially for anxiety and depression, which is, as we've also talked about, is the sort of the main two conditions, as it were, that seem to be affecting, according to some numbers, up to 10 million people. And you've just touched there on, mental health can be very complex. What about the sort of another group who maybe aren't in work, but who are experiencing very severe mental health problems? Is that where the medical answer comes in? Is that where we should be, psychiatrists, the NHS should be focusing their attention on that group? Or who's in charge there, really?
Right. And I think that I would then say the work environment is not separate from all the other environments and experiences we have. It's just one of a number of things we will all typically experience. We'll all typically experience our family, some degree of personal education, and then the next generation's education, some work experience, some community involvement. So there's multiple areas that we are all playing in, if you like.
Right.
And work is one of them.
Sure.
And work is a very important one because being in work is one of the indicators of good mental health. The problem is having a good boss doesn't necessarily always go with being in good work. At the same time, as we've already alluded to, there may be stresses elsewhere. And we're all playing in these other communities as parents, as children or grandchildren, as students, as teachers, as customers, and as neighbors. And I think that the challenge of good mental health in its 95% context of anxiety and depression, the same principles hold true of paying attention to your neighbors. And that's something that we saw much more of in the pandemic than before. Like most of us, I'm part of our street WhatsApp group, and we made sure that during the worst of the times, people had access to whatever it was they needed. And we also just stayed in touch in a way that had not happened before. So I think the volunteer movements, which the UK has always been particularly strong in, have all come out of the pandemic stronger than they went into it.
Right.
Samaritans is certainly, that's absolutely the case. But it's true of many other organizations. And I think it's that, taking that principle of talking and listening and helping out into the different environments, that's the answer, and that's who's responsible. Looking at the NHS, as you said, we've talked about it before, we are prescribing twice as many antidepressants as we did a decade ago, and millions of people are on them and have been on them. And they undoubtedly will help some people at certain points. But a mass prescription, which is all that GPs can do, because they only have 6 minutes per patient or whatever it is, 6 or 7 minutes, they can't get beyond prescribing a pill.
So somehow there's almost like a COVID bounce. There's something positive that's come out of this. How can we harness more this kind of neighborly goodwill, as you say, this kind of spirit of volunteering? I know it's wonderful that you said that, far more people are volunteering for the Samaritans than ever before. What can we all do to sort of encourage it further, to support one another, as you say, in all these different spheres?
And I think some of it is going to be about keeping going new things that have started in the pandemic. I think at the other end of the scale, there are things that central and local government needs to do differently that we've discovered during the pandemic. So we all probably have our own list of things that we think government did well or didn't do so well. But when you stop and analyze what they set out to do and what did and didn't work, what you find is that we are particularly in the UK, overly reliant on a view that says government needs to fix this problem.
Interesting.
And as a result, we look too much to Whitehall and Parliament and government, and they take too many initiatives without engaging local government. So one of the things that has been very obvious to me, and we saw it during some of the conflict between elected mayors and government last summer, was that there wasn't enough being handed to local government to do. If we think about what the NHS does versus care homes. So early in the pandemic, we had the issue over care home mortality being significantly worse and the hospitals sending patients out. Now, it's relatively easy to run the acute hospital network from Whitehall, because you only need 125 phone numbers. And so even though that sounds like quite a lot, with a group of civil servants, you can issue instructions. So the NHS, like government, is very top-down, very concentrated. But when it comes to care homes, where there was a much more acute problem, there's 27,000 of them currently listed as regulated in England alone.
Wow.
There's no way you can deal with that sector from Whitehall. And it is part of the reason that the current plan to solve social care is doomed at the start, because central government can't solve that. That has to be managed locally. And I think particularly in England, and it's a very stark contrast with Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and the Republic, that we tend not to be using local government. We default to everything being run from the centre. And to me, that was again, a very big lesson from the pandemic, that things that should have been done locally, when the centre tried to do them, they just plain didn't work.
Wow, that's so brilliantly kind of analysed. No wonder you had a career as a consultant. I'd have paid money to be your client and get a kind of brilliant analysis of what's going on. But but from an individual point of view, yes, I totally get your point of like local government being given more autonomy, more power, more funds. What can we do as individuals? I think, obviously we can volunteer, but what's your advice to sort of someone listening who's thinking, I'd like to make a difference?
I think the biggest thing I would say is a little can go a very long way. So I'm conscious and become more conscious the longer I stay in the charity world, and having chaired 3 charities, I think, there are now dozens of different places I could go and make a difference. But actually, I need to focus on one. And so I spent 6 years as chair of the Mental Health Foundation, which is a great charity. And then when I finished my second term, I stepped away entirely, as I think is appropriate. It then needs a fresh look. And I was approached by headhunters saying, well, would you like to chair this charity or that charity, various household names next? And I said, well, having gone through the experience of acquiring just enough knowledge to be dangerous in mental health, I do not want to move into a new sector. The sector I can make a difference in is mental health, because I now know enough about it and have been engaged in it for long enough. So when you next come up with a charity that needs a new chair who's in mental health, yep, I'll be definitely interested. But anything else, I'm going to politely say no to. So I think I wouldn't be, to anyone who says, what can I do? I would say, look for something close to home that you can do and you can sustain for the longer term. And just say, that's my thing.
Yes.
And yes, I could do 20 things and maybe hundreds of things that would benefit from my time or my money or my support. I'm going to do this one thing.
I really like that, as it's making me thinking about myself, which is that, we all have different gifts. And I think if I feel that if I make a difference, I'm a good communicator, and I like to communicate, and I like to find out from other people in the field, which is one of the reasons I like hosting these interviews. And maybe that's what I can contribute, and just to sort of focus on that. I may not be able to do, I couldn't run a charity, but I can do this bit, and sort of trying to get the issues out there and share what, the wisdom of people who've really, given a whole lifetime to sort of thinking about some of these things. Keith, that's been absolutely fantastic. We've got about another 10 minutes or so. Just I wanted to turn sort of in a little bit more detail to the Samaritans. Do I say Samaritans or they're Samaritans?
You can say anything you like. Typically, I
Okay.
would say Samaritans in the UK and Ireland, because partly to make a point that we're one of the very few institutions that covers the Republic and Ireland as a whole, not
Okay.
just the UK.
Okay. So I was thinking about your role there, and I was thinking that, to a lot of people, that would be a pretty tough gig. I mean, you are on the front line. You must be dealing with some very, very sad stories of, obviously you help people in the sense that you stop people taking their own lives. You have, I think, 20,000 volunteers, it's about that level. But you are in a very painful, and if not the most painful area of all, which is suicide. And I just wondered how you found that experience of chairing the Samaritans.
Well, at one level, Rachel, I'm insulated from it because I'm not personally taking calls.
Mm-hmm.
We do provide a whole range of services. So not just a traditional phone service, but also web chat, email, face-to-face may open up again post-pandemic. Letters, people write letters still.
Mm-hmm.
And also there's a huge program of outreach in the rail and other transport industries, construction, outreach to schools, universities.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a huge activity lobbying and influencing government, NHS, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So partly because I'm already spending a very large amount of my time on it, and it's a volunteer role, I'm focused very much on externally, what are we saying and how are we influencing people so that we improve the environment so fewer people would want to even think about taking their own life. And also, we don't make it as easy for people to obtain the means or opportunity. And we focus on those who are most in need of support. The other thing that I spend my time on is internally looking at the fitness of the organization. So I talked about us being both physically and mentally more or less fit from day to day. And it takes a lot of work to support the 20,000 volunteers, which is what the organization is there for. But it also needs to be ready to move on and stop doing things which are no longer as effective and start doing new things. Some of that's new technologies. Mm-hmm. Some of it is steadily improving the quality and safety of what we do. Because as you say, we deal with very vulnerable people. Mm-hmm. And we have to all the time be watchful that no one who is wanting to exploit vulnerable people gets access to them. And we have to be watchful that particularly as we're all learning how to be more effective in those conversations, that the quality of what our individual Samaritan listening volunteers are doing is getting better and better all the time. And that's challenging.
Yeah, yeah. And how do you personally cope with your own stress in that situation of running a big charity? Obviously, as you say, multidimensional. What are your own recipes for looking after yourself?
Well, obviously, having been more than 6 decades on the planet, I've learned a bit about myself and what I'm good at doing, what I'm less good at doing. And for me, the thing to always watch out for is overcommitting and saying yes to the many opportunities to do worthwhile things. Because even though it's technically a part-time job, now I could be 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, working on Samaritans tasks. So I'm in the first year of this role. So I'm saying to people, and one of the reasons I'm saying it is to talk to myself about it. I'm being quite unboundaried in this first year. So I'm spending too much time on too many things. And once I'm a year in, and our chief exec is also going to be a year in at about the same time, we promised we're going to sit down together and say, all right, second year onwards, what are we going to get a whole lot more focused in doing? Because I don't think you can do that at the start. You have to recognize first year is going to be, let's just try a bunch of stuff.
Do you have any quick advice to how to say no? Because it is such an important way of reducing stress. How do you personally say no?
I think there's two ways that are working for me. One is I'd love to do it, but I'm already committed to doing X, where X is something that clearly is important. And people say, I can see why you'd make that trade-off.
Yeah.
And X can also be looking after the 2-year-old granddaughter as well.
Oh.
The other thing, which we're doing more of at Samaritans, is also finding more people to take on roles that I could do. So it's also about more resources and saying, I can't do it, but this person could.
Delegate. Well, all I can say is here at Inspire the Mind, we're really grateful that you found the time to say yes to us. We know how very busy you are. I just wanted to, one last thing, our series is called Inspire the Mind. And I was struck when you were saying, you know, how can you, I mean, maybe this is a bit of an odd link, but, you know, if someone's feeling very desperate, I'm not saying they're necessarily wanting to take their own life, but what would you say to someone to inspire their mind, you know, to keep punching, to keep going in this great, joyful thing of life? What would you say to inspire them?
I would say, think of when you have been content with both what you've done and how you are. And find that sweet spot and think about when you've been there and how you'll get there again.
That's really wonderful. Keith, Leslie, it's just been I feel quite emotional because it's just amazing what you do. And it's been a real honor and privilege to talk to you. So thank you very much. Thank you for being on Inspire the Mind. And thank you all very much to our listeners. So our next podcast, I'm not sure what we can call them, maybe not podcasts. What do we call them? Our next episode, I think. Yes, our next episode, I will be talking to Johnny Benjamin, who is a writer and mental health advocate and the founder of a mental health charity. So join me then. And meanwhile, once again, thank you to Keith. And I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. Many thanks.